Hello! Welcome to another day of the Internet Measurement Village. Joining us today, we're so glad to have Philipp Winter from the Tor project, who's going to be telling us all about circumventing internet censorship with Tor. Thanks for joining us, Philipp.
Thank you so much, Artur. Thanks for having me. And thanks everyone for coming today. Good morning. So my name is Philipp, and I do anti-censorship work with the Tor project. And for the next 35 minutes, I will give you a brief overview of how you can use the Tor network to circumvent censorship. I will give you an overview of what we accomplished over the last year or so. And finally, what's going to be next on our roadmap in terms of anti-censorship. And then I hope to spend as much time answering questions as we can. So my focus would be Q&A and hopefully not ramble on for too long. So let me start by giving you a brief overview of how Tor works. When I say Tor, I mean Tor browser. So Tor browser is what you're going to use when you use the Tor network. It's basically a fork of Firefox, the web browser. So Tor browser basically routes your network packets over a series of 3 randomly chosen relays that are all run by volunteers of the Tor network. And what happens is when you use Tor browser, a server like Facebook wouldn't get to see your real IP address, but instead it would see the IP address of one of these relays of the Tor network. So in a sense, you can think of Tor browser decoupling who you are on the internet in terms of your IP address. It decouples the who you are from what you're doing online. And at the moment, we have approximately 6,000 of these relays that are live in the Tor network. And typically when people think about Tor browser and what it can do for them, they think of anonymizing your IP address. And that is true, but it's not the only thing that Tor browser does. It just happens to be the easiest thing to think about. But Tor browser also helps you with maybe disguising the fact that you're using Tor in the first place. So this is where our anti-censorship technology comes in. It also prevents browser fingerprinting, and it can block cookies and scripts for you. It tries to not write anything to disk, and it also tries hard to not keep any browser history. So all these things are just as valuable to maintain your privacy as the disguising of your IP address is. And all of this is good for your privacy, and it gives you anonymity. But the big problem is that standard Tor happens to be very easy to block for censors, meaning that there are several choke points that ISPs and governments can exploit to block access to the network. And to give you just a few examples, we have 8 what we call directory authorities. So these are computers that basically collect information about all the relays and serve it to clients. And these 8 computers, they don't really change very often. So their IP address is hard-coded in Tor browser. And as a result, they're very easy to block for governments and ISPs. And that is also what is happening in various places. Same goes for all these relays. Blocking these relays is as simple as downloading a list of them every hour or so and adding them to your block list. And as a result, that is also something that we're witnessing in several countries. And China and Iran being a good example of that. So all of this makes it relatively easy to block Tor, but luckily there are ways around that. So we can quickly walk through how you would go about unblocking Tor and use the Tor network in the face of censorship. So the very first step is, how can you get Tor browser if you can't even reach the website torproject.org? Because the domain is often blocked on a DNS level. And as a result, our users are struggling with even getting Tor browser. And the answer to that question is a service that we call getTor. And it basically does what the name suggests. It helps you get Tor. And you do that by sending an email to gettor@torproject.org. And we don't have someone who's busy responding to email all the time. This is actually an automated service. And whenever it gets a request, it responds with an email that contains download links to where you can download Tor. And I have an example here on the slide. In the email body, all you need to specify is your operating system. So you can write here Windows or Linux or OS X. And when you send this email, within a few seconds, you should get a response that looks like that. And in here, in the email, you can see download links for Tor browser on GitHub, on GitLab, on the Internet Archive, and on Google Drive. So you see that the download links aren't on torproject.org. We chose these download links carefully, so at least one of them should work basically anywhere in the world, hopefully. So if you feel like not a single one of these links work for you, then please let us know, and we will hopefully add more to this list. So the goal is really for people to be able to download Tor browser no matter the kind of censorship that they're exposed to. So with the help of getTor, you're hopefully able to download Tor browser. And once you have it up and running, it may not work for you because of the reasons I mentioned earlier. Maybe the directory authorities are blocked, or maybe the relays are blocked, which means that Tor browser will stall and you won't be able to get it to bootstrap for you. The answer to that problem is what we call bridges. And bridges are basically like relays, except that they're private in the sense that you can't just get all the bridges at once. We basically rate limit the handing out of bridges. So the idea is that if you are a censored user and you need bridges to connect to the Tor network, we try to make it so it's easy for you to get a few of these bridges, but hard to get all of them. And the idea is that censors shouldn't be able to get all these bridges, because if they end up blocking them, our users won't be able to use them. And when you start your Tor browser for the first time, you could use what we call default bridges. And they're called default bridges because they're hard-coded inside Tor browser. And you may think, what good is that? Because if they're really part of Tor browser, they're effectively public, which is true. But even though they're effectively public, it doesn't mean that they're not working. So it turns out that in a lot of countries that go through some effort to block the Tor network, you are able to use the default bridges in Tor browser. And we currently ship Tor browser with 17 different default bridges. Most of them run our OBFS4 pluggable transport, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about later. But at this point, I would like to thank all the volunteers who run these default bridges, because they're not, in fact, operated by the Tor project itself. We don't run the network. We just ask our friends and colleagues to help out with that. So these 17 bridges are hard-coded in Tor browser, and it may be good enough to get around censorship already without really doing anything other than selecting these default bridges in your Tor browser. And if default bridges are not good enough, BridgeDB hopefully can come to the rescue for you. So this is short for the Bridge database, and it's a service that we run that does the bridge distribution for us. It knows about all the approximately 1,300 bridges that we have as of now, and it uses 3 different bridge distribution mechanisms to give these bridges to you. And one mechanism is a very simple web page, which you can see here on the slide. And when you go to bridges.torproject.org, you can see the web page that is visible here on the slide. And if you click on Get Bridges, step number 2, what you should see is a window that shows you a CAPTCHA to solve. And the CAPTCHA is here to fend off bots that are trying to scrape as many bridges as they can to just block them. So this is why users have to solve a CAPTCHA. And it's by no means perfect. We are in fact struggling with bots that are still relatively successful at solving these CAPTCHAs, because in the age of deep learning, a CAPTCHA just cannot provide you the sense of protection it did about 10 years ago. But having a CAPTCHA is still better than having no CAPTCHA. But anyway, after solving this CAPTCHA, you will end up with a page that looks like this. And it will give you a handful of bridges that you can copy and paste into your Tor browser. And that should then, in many countries, be enough to get your Tor browser to work. And what it looks like in your Tor browser settings is like this. So we worked on integrating our new circumvention options into the settings of Tor browser, which hopefully makes the entire process more usable than it was before. And we finally have another option that we call Moat, which allows you to request bridges directly in your Tor browser. So in this case, as you can see here, you just go to your settings, you go to the tab that says Tor, and you can then request bridges directly in Tor browser. You will then again be asked to solve a CAPTCHA, and BridgeDB will then provide you with bridges. And this feature should work anywhere. So you should be able to get bridges anywhere, but the bridges you may end up getting may not work everywhere. So for example, China has been relatively successful at scraping parts of the bridges that we have in BridgeDB. So while you should be able to get bridges in China, they may not work for you because they're already blocked. But nonetheless, for a lot of other places, it's a very usable and effective feature. And when I say bridges, then I mean one out of a variety of possible bridges. And we have this concept that we call pluggable-transports. And what they do is they basically reshape your network traffic to make it look different from standard Tor. And this is why these pluggable transports are effective in circumventing censorship, because they have some sort of algorithm that makes your traffic look different. And our, I would almost say, standard protocol so far is OBFS4, which is, as the name suggests, the fourth in a series of iterations of past obfuscation protocols. And to the best of my knowledge, OBFS4 works everywhere, meaning that I don't know of a country that consistently is able to detect the protocol itself. So countries are able to detect, or rather to scrape bridges and to block them. But as far as I know, no country is able to detect the protocol itself. And I understand that this may not be a very useful distinction for our users, but the developers and researchers among you might find that interesting. So if you have evidence that suggests otherwise, I would be very interested in hearing from you. And this also means that if you set up a private OBFS4 bridge, one that is not reporting itself to BridgeDB, we are confident that this works in China. So we have tried this in the past with a lot of users, and private OBFS4 bridges should in fact work and not be blocked by the Great Firewall. We also have Meek, which implements an idea that is called domain fronting. And the idea is to basically tunnel the Tor traffic over Microsoft's Azure Content Delivery Network. And a sensor, so the idea is that a sensor cannot tell the difference between someone just browsing pages inside Microsoft's Azure Content Delivery Network, and there are in fact a lot of pages on this Content Delivery Network. And this still works very well. In fact, Meek also works in China. The only problem is that it's really slow. And it is slow because we actually have to pay a lot for it to operate. It's many thousands of dollars per month, and we had to, in fact, cap it at some point because the costs are unfortunately just not sustainable. Because, well, it turns out that Microsoft actually charges a lot of money for people to use the Azure cloud. And finally, we have a system that is called Snowflake, which is relatively new in a sense that it's very much a work in progress, but it's already at a point where it's usable and it's already part of the Tor browser alpha. So you can actually give it a shot today. And the idea of Snowflake is to have a lot of short-lived proxies. So instead of have dedicated bridges on, say, VPS systems that run for a very long time, the idea is for people to install a browser add-on, the Snowflake browser add-on, and it turns your browser into a circumvention proxy. And as you hop from one location to another, as you are maybe sitting in the coffee shop and then going back home, you change IP addresses, but that doesn't actually have a big effect on the people relying on your proxy because of reasons that I will mention later. So this was a very quick recap of the circumvention options that we have. And I would like to give you a brief overview of what is new in Tor's anti-censorship role, so what we have accomplished over the last year or so, because there are, in fact, a bunch of really exciting things that have happened in our space. The first thing that is new is the anti-censorship team. So we now have an actual team inside the Tor project that is working on topics about anti-censorship. And this team exists for a little bit more than a year now. We have weekly meetings, we have a team mailing list, and it's basically our responsibility to make sure that our users can circumvent censorship, and we take care of infrastructure and a bunch of other things. And if this sounds interesting to you, then you should join us. We have, like I said, weekly meetings, and at the bottom of this slide, I have a URL to our meeting pad, and it contains the time we meet. It is on the OFTC IRC network, and we meet once a week, every Thursday. And the best way to get involved, I would say, is to just show up at the meeting, introduce yourself, and we will help you get started. And at this point, I also want to thank all of my colleagues, because I would say we're about a dozen people who regularly show up at the meetings, and we all do various things from development work to usability work to dealing with our bridge volunteers and design work and documentation. So there's a lot of people who do a lot of work. And I really just happen to be the messenger today, but the bulk of the work is all done by my colleagues. Okay, so let me give you an overview of what is new in our respective projects. And let's start with Snowflake. So Snowflake has come a long way thanks to Cecilia and David and Arlo, who have been doing the heavy lifting over the last 1 and 2 years. And what is new in Snowflake is a system that is called Turbo Tunnel. And it's really exciting because it makes it so when you use Snowflake and you're connecting to a proxy and this proxy goes offline, it doesn't destroy all your TCP sessions. Instead, it makes it so it can transparently port these TCP sessions over to a different proxy. So it doesn't break your user experience. And this was a huge step forward usability-wise. So Snowflake is in fact much more pleasant to use since we put Turbo Tunnel into it. And like I mentioned earlier, it's already part of Tor browser alpha, but we need some more time to work on it to get it into the stable Tor browser. But that should be coming over the next few months. And there also have been an awful lot of reliability and usability fixes. So it's a very complex engineering problem with a lot of moving bits and pieces. And I would also say it's very much of an experiment. I would say for a long time, it wasn't even clear if something like Snowflake can even work. But there have been a lot of usability fixes, and it's at a point where I would say it is actually usable and you should give it a shot. And we also have thousands of volunteer proxies that your Tor browser would be relying on when using Snowflake. And thanks to our Google Summer of Code student, Hashik, he's working on an Android proxy app. So you will be able to also install the Snowflake app on your Android phone and help censored users that way. Now let's move over to BridgeDB. Again, we had a strong focus on usability work, and we fixed a ton of usability issues. And there were a lot of these in BridgeDB, and there still are, I'm afraid. One thing we did was to improve the autoresponder So the autoresponder was notoriously difficult to use because it expected you to send commands to it, not only commands, but commands that had parameters tied to it, and people had a really hard time getting it to work. And not just our users, but also my colleagues inside the Tor project were often struggling with making it so that it would actually respond with bridges. And that's a really bad sign. If the people who work for the Tor project can't even get it to work, how can we expect our users to deal with that? So we made it so that the autoresponder would always respond with bridges to you when you send an email to bridges@torproject.org. So I forgot to mention that earlier. I told you about our 3 distribution mechanisms, which is the web page I showed you and the settings inside Tor browser. And you can also send an email to bridges@torproject.org, and it will respond with bridges. And hopefully the process is significantly more smooth now. Another thing we did was we worked with our metrics team to show a bridges distribution mechanism on the respective relay search page. So we had our bridge operators would frequently ask what distribution mechanism their bridge is in, and we would be able to tell them. And now all of this is automated. So if you set up a new bridge, you're able to tell, oh, my bridge is being distributed using the email autoresponder. And finally, we also spend some time improving the captchas that BridgeDB asks you to solve before it will give you bridges. And again, these captchas were notoriously difficult to solve. And judging by the log files that we took a look at, approximately 50% of users were able to solve it correctly, which is a nightmare. And at this point, I think it's more than 80%, which is still not perfect, but much better than 50%. We also spent a lot of time working on metrics. Metrics may not sound very exciting to users, but I can assure you it's extremely important for us as developers, but also for researchers, because it allows us to understand how our systems are being used, how the usability falls short, and it also allows us to focus on the right things. And these metrics were actually quite a bit of work to get it to run in a sane way, because they're obviously privacy preserving. We thought we designed them very carefully so they don't reveal anything about our users. And they are in fact published. So BridgeDB publishes usage metrics once a day, and you can use the collector service to find these metrics. And some of these metrics are also part of metrics.torproject.org. So you can, for example, see the number of user requests per distributor for BridgeDB. And I would say that they have been really valuable for us to understand BridgeDB better and to focus on the mechanisms, the bridge distribution mechanisms that are used the most by our users. And there also have been a lot of changes under the hood. I'm not going to go into these a lot because I think they're not very interesting to our users or also developers, but we keep working on making BridgeDB reliable and work well for our users. Now let's move on to bridges. We have some news here as well. We worked very hard to update our bridge setup guides. So we have guides for 11 different operating systems. So if you run, say, Debian or Red Hat or any other popular Linux distribution or maybe FreeBSD, you can go to the first link where we have detailed guides that tell you how you can set up an OBFS4 bridge. So we curate these guides, and they should all be up to date and working for you. But if there are any problems, please reach out, send me an email, or maybe let us know during our anti-censorship meeting if there are any problems, and we will fix them right away. We also worked on a Docker image that allows you to easily set up an OBFS4 bridge. And again, just check out the link that is here on the slide. And it should make it possible for you to set up a bridge very quickly, much faster, in fact, than doing it yourself manually. And we also still have a bunch of usability problems, not just with our pluggable transports, but with Tor itself. So one problem is that when you set up a bridge, Tor tests its onion routing port, but it does not test its pluggable transport port yet. It's something that we're working on, but what this means is that you can set up an OBFS4 bridge and your log files suggest that everything is working fine, but your port, your OBFS4 port may actually be blocked by your firewall. And you may not even realize that, which is, well, a problem. We wrote a small, basically port scan tool that allows our bridge operators to test their port just in case they want to be confident that everything works. So the third URL on this slide allows you to just put in your bridge's IP address and your port, and it will tell you if the service can talk to your port or not. So it's really just a small quality of life improvement that we wrote for our bridge operators. Next up is scaling and monitoring infrastructure. When we started the anti-censorship team just a little bit more than a year ago, the problem we had was that we had a lot of infrastructure to maintain. We have, for example, GetTor, we have BridgeDB, we have our default bridges, and also our autoresponders. And these are particularly critical because some pieces of our infrastructure would just die without anyone noticing, in particular our autoresponders. And then at some point we would get an email from a user saying, hey, look, I sent an email to GetTor, and after many hours, I still haven't gotten anything. And then we would take a look at the log files and see, oh gosh, it has been offline for days. It broke days ago and no one realized. So we did spend quite some time writing scripts and setting up systems to monitor our infrastructure. And I'm happy to say that it's at a point where everything is automated to a point where we get an email if something breaks and we can get right to it, including our autoresponders. So ever since a few weeks, a few months ago, everything should be working much smoother than it did a few months ago. And hopefully this is also something that makes the quality of life for our users much better. And the same goes for our default bridges. Before the anti-censorship team, we also had about a dozen default bridges, but many of those were offline and no one had a good idea of who were the people that were running these default bridges. So we spent quite some time removing default bridges that were not online anymore, and asked people to set up new ones, and also curate the relationships that we have with our default bridge operators. So again, we have a pretty good idea of how well they work now, and we regularly email our default bridge operators if any of these bridges go offline. And usually these problems are fixed within a matter of hours now, and no longer within a matter of weeks. And we also worked on a bridge campaign last August in which we incentivized people to set up more bridges, and it resulted in, I think it was 100 to 150 new bridges. And if all of this sounds exciting to you, and if you would like to stay up to date on what the anti-censorship team is up to, then I would encourage you to take a look at our monthly reports. So every month, at the end of the month, we compile a monthly report that summarizes the progress we made the past month. And it's actually June 30 today. So this is my sign that I should really get to it and work on our June report. But I would say it's a really good method to stay up to date on the work that we have been doing. So let me move on to the last part of my presentation, which is what is next. I just told you the progress we have made, but what is on our roadmap right now? One thing is that we are working on making Snowflake more stable. So I told you that we already incorporated Turbo Tunnel into it, but there are still a bunch of usability and reliability issues that we are ironing out. And hopefully in a few months from now, we will have Snowflake inside of Tor browser, and it can be used just like any other pluggable transport. And progress has been great so far. So this is still something we pay very close attention to and that we're working on a lot. When it comes to bridge distribution, there are a bunch of exciting changes that we're looking into. And one is a new bridge distribution mechanism. There is a system that is called Salmon, and it was first introduced in a research paper that was published, I believe, at the Privacy Enhancing Technologies Symposium in 2017, I believe. And it introduces a system that is called a social proxy distributor. So the idea is that you can sign up for Salmon and you then get a bridge. And as the bridge that you got remains unblocked, the system Salmon gains increasing confidence in you not being a censor. And conversely, if Salmon hands out a bridge and suddenly the bridge is blocked shortly after it was handed out to a user, Salmon believes, okay, this person who just signed up and got this bridge is likely to be a censor, and this person will get fewer bridges in the future. So this is roughly the idea. As you get a bridge and as it remains unblocked, your reputation score increases. And you can also invite other people to Salmon, and the same rules apply to these other people. And what makes Salmon really interesting to us is that it has a notion of a bridge being full. And that means that once a specific set of people were assigned to a bridge, it's considered full and no more people will get the bridge. And if all these people are in fact actual users and not censors, then the bridge will just continue to work and it won't be blocked. And we are in the very early stages of looking into that system and thinking about its constraints and perhaps how we can integrate it into our infrastructure. But I think it's safe to say that it's a really interesting concept and we want to experiment with it and see where it takes us. Another thing that we are working on is a feedback loop between BridgeDB and Uni. So the idea is that if you are a user in Turkey and you desperately need a bridge, then you may get one from BridgeDB, but it may end up being blocked in Turkey, meaning that, well, it's not going to help you. So the idea is that we want to make BridgeDB smart by having it talk to Uni. So BridgeDBs should give Uni bridge addresses to test, to scan, and then the test results will be fed back into BridgeDB. So hopefully this will get us to a point that if you are a user in Turkey and you get a bridge, then it should work in your country because BridgeDB is smart enough to know, okay, this particular bridge is blocked in both Iran and Turkey, so I will not hand it out to users in these countries. And another thing that we're looking into is to test bridges before handing them out. So I mentioned earlier that unfortunately it's possible to set up an OBFS4 bridge that looks like it's working, but it's not actually working. So we're working on making BridgeDB smarter so it periodically tests its bridges, and if they turn out to be broken, it will not hand them out to users. And finally, you'll see that there is a theme that we're making all of our infrastructure smarter. And again, we also want to make Tor browser smarter because it turns out that it could be much smarter in the way it helps you circumvent censorship. So for example, at this point, you need to manually supply Tor browser with bridges, which is quite a usability problem. So we're thinking about ways to make Tor browser assist you in the process. And we're at the brainstorming phase. We don't really have an actual path to go down already. But we thought about ways like Tor browser could, for example, ask the user, tell me what country are you in so I can pick the best circumvention option for you. And when you say I'm sitting in, say, Turkey, then Tor browser has some hard-coded information, or maybe will have some hard-coded information that says these particular circumvention options work in Turkey. And then Tor browser could do as much as it can to make it work for you and not expect you to do the censorship circumvention. So again, we're really in an early phase here, but yeah, we're thinking about basically putting more smartness into Tor browser so our users don't have all the responsibility to make it work for them. And you can see that this is all a lot of work. So we have quite a roadmap ahead of us, which leads me to my next point, which is that we need your help to accomplish all these goals. And there are a lot of ways in which you can help. So if you have a little bit of time on your hands, then no matter your expertise, there are probably ways you can assist us. And one way in which we could always use help is to help us set up new relays, bridges, and also snowflakes. So if you have dedicated machines, for example, a VPS that always runs, then a relay or a bridge is the way to go. If you don't have that, then I would say just install a Snowflake in your web browser, and you're already helping users that way. If you know how to write code, then help us write code. Most of our projects are written in Golang or in Python. We also try to do our best to measure and document censorship. For example, I mentioned earlier that we intend to make Tor browser smarter, and part of that involves getting an idea of how Tor is blocked in different parts of the world. So that is also something we could definitely help with. And if you're interested in helping out, like I mentioned earlier, the best way to get started is to just come and join us during our IRC meeting every Thursday. So I hope that I will see some new people show up the coming Thursday. And that brings me to the end of my talk. And I would like to thank you very much for your attention and for your interest in showing up today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Philipp. Thank you so much for that really interesting presentation on the great work that you and your colleagues are doing at the Tor project. I will remind people that are listening to the stream online that you can, as usual, leave questions in the YouTube chat. You can leave them on the #UNI IRC channel on OFTC or the Slack channel as well. And as well as the pad that we have set up, which you see the link scrolling on your screen below. We've had quite some participation from people leaving a lot of comments and sharing a lot of great vibes. And I'll read to you some of the questions that people have left. So the first question comes from David F. And the question is, there are many results for Tor in app stores. What Tor mobile apps are safe to use?
Right, that is an excellent question. The one and only one that is safe to use is Tor browser on Android. So we have some people that have been working on that inside the Tor project. And before that, we also have the Guardian project working on Tor for Android. And basically, these are safe to use. And this is a really good question because there are a lot of projects that use our name to sell whatever it is that they're selling. And it's really important to be careful here because God knows what these tools are really doing. And a lot of them are just fake. Yeah, like I said, the Guardian project has been working very closely with the Tor project to provide Tor on Android. And now there is a Tor browser for Android. So these are the ones that are safe to use.
Great. And we can maybe also put a link to these apps in the video description. So if people watching this video, you'll probably be able to find the links to the safe apps in the video. So we have another question, again, comes from David F. Where can someone ask questions about Tor and get support?
Right. There are a lot of ways to do that. I think it depends partly on what kind of question you have. So to give you a quick overview, we have our mailing lists. You can go to lists.torproject.org, and we have discussion lists for different topics, for general talk around Tor, for Tor development, for relay setup, and depending on what it is that you're interested in, you just pick one of these mailing lists. Another option is IRC, and I understand that this is not the 90s anymore, and a lot of you may not want to hear that, but we have IRC channels, and it just so happens that most of the developers are very active there, and it may, in fact, be the easiest way to reach out to developers and ask questions. Beyond that, there is a front desk that we have where people can also ask questions to get support for Tor. So I would say that these are three popular channels. And I also have to admit here that it's not necessarily perfect. I feel like there is a need to have a more direct tie to our community, which isn't quite there yet. And we also have a blog where people frequently post blog comments. And the problem is we have to moderate because you can't just approve anything, but people are unhappy about that too. And it doesn't quite allow for the sort of discussion we would like to have. So there is also a bit of a need for something better. And we're thinking about that, how we can foster a better relationship with our community. But I think for now, the answer is IRC and our mailing lists and maybe our front desk and maybe even the blog.
Great, thanks. And we can also add. I see Maria is sharing in the comments, in the live comments. There are links, but we can also add them to the video description after. So we have another question that comes from Anadats. And the question is, what happens if an ISP blocks all some Tor directory authorities? A, as a relay operator, can I set up a relay on this ISP? B, as a user, can I connect to Tor and hopefully fallback gears will work? So basically, he's asking, like, if an ISP is blocking all or some Tor directory authorities, how do I behave as a relay operator,
Right.
or as a user?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's start with relay operators. The problem here is that you will run into trouble, I expect, because when you set up a relay, it announces itself to the Tor network by publishing what it's called a server descriptor to the directory authorities. And when it is unable to do that, it won't be able to publish itself. So to get around that, you will probably need some sort of tunnel to be able to upload your server descriptor, which also raises the question, if the ISP already blocks the directory authorities, maybe it also interferes with relay operations. So that is a little bit tricky depending on what exactly is going on. But if you're running into that sort of trouble, reach out to us. So we have pretty good support channels over IRC and the mailing list for relay operators, and we pay close attention to that to make sure that our relay operators get the help that they need. When it comes to users, if the directory authorities are blocked, you may run into problems, but this is exactly the sort of problem that our circumvention options are supposed to fix for you. So if the directory authorities are blocked, you should be able to just start Tor browser and use our default bridges, and that way you can get around the censorship.
Excellent. We have another question coming from Federico, and he asks, how does Salmon identify users? If a sensor uses dynamic IP addresses to fetch bridges, will future users connecting from those addresses be affected?
Right. The way it identifies users is not by IP address, but rather by sort of profile, I would say. It's not very well defined, but you could think of it as we may have some kind of, say, web page that allows you to log in. And this is how Salmon could identify you. It's definitely not by IP address for the very reasons that you mentioned yourself. And yeah, the entire thing isn't very well defined yet. So for example, there are two ways to join Salmon. You could sign up by being invited, or you could sign up out of the blue. And if you sign up out of the blue, the Salmon paper suggests that you prove ownership of a Facebook account. And we acknowledge that this is not necessarily something that would work very well for our demographic of users. So there are a lot of open questions that we're thinking about. And maybe there are other ways to do that, some kind of proof of work scheme, or maybe we will ask people to solve captchas, or who knows, maybe a Facebook account maybe is the way to go for some users. But to answer your question, it's basically some sort of profile that you will have, but it's too soon to give you more details, simply because these details aren't fleshed out yet.
Right. Well, thanks for that. So we have another question coming from Rithika. And the question is, have you found any interesting issues in your usability studies that you can share with us? Do you have special IRC channels to brainstorm solutions for these usability studies?
That is a good question. So I'm probably not the best person to answer that. For that, our usability team lead, Antonella, would be perfect. And I try to at least answer some of the question. So I can't share any interesting results with you directly, but there are some research papers on the topic. That is what I wanted to mention. There are academics who frequently study various aspects of the Tor network, and there are about half a dozen interesting research papers around Tor and usability. So that is something I would encourage you to take a look at. And to reach out to us, I would again recommend our weekly meeting, and that way we can get you in touch with Antonella, who I'm sure has all the answers for you.
Yeah, and I would add that I believe the Tor UX team. Well, there used to be a weekly UX meeting,
Exactly. Yes.
which happens on the #Tor meeting channel, and I believe it's actually today. At least that was the schedule once upon a time. But I'm sure we can get this information from Antonella and perhaps put a link in the video description to that resource as well. So we have another question coming from Anadats. And I see somebody just left a link in the pad with we are resuming our open meetings next Tuesday in IRC. The details are here. Perfect. So there's your answer. So we have another question coming from Anadats. How can one help the Tor network grow and become more diverse?
Right. So when it comes to growing the Tor network, I would say that there are relays, there are bridges, there are now also snowflakes. And when it comes to relays, the problem we sometimes see is that these relays are often too concentrated in certain ISPs. For example, there are a finite set of VPS providers that people really like to use, for example, OVH or DigitalOcean. And there isn't necessarily anything wrong with using these, but we don't want all of our network capacity to be controlled by these ISPs. One way to move forward is to just identify networks that are not as prevalent on the Tor network and set up relays there. And that often means dealing with annoying terms of service and dealing with other issues that people that use DigitalOcean may not have. So that is one answer to that question. And I would say the same more or less applies to bridges. So we want more diversity in terms of not only logical locations inside ISPs, but also inside countries. So I think most of relays are probably located in North America and Western Europe, and that also should change. So if you're in a country that is not in Northern America or Western Europe, then please set up a relay in your country and help grow the network outside of these hotspots for Tor relays.
Great. Thanks for that. So we have another question, which is from Oliver L. And the question is, are Tor onion services already safe against DDoS attacks? I know there have been some fixes in the last year. And he goes on to say, I hope the question has not yet been answered in the presentation. Unfortunately, it came a little late.
So I'm not able to tell you the state of that now because I'm not involved in onion service development myself. So I would say this is a pretty good question to ask on IRC, where some of our where all of our onion service developers are present. I know that people have been working on that quite a lot, but I don't know to what degree these changes have been deployed already. So I'm afraid I can't help you out here.
Fair enough. Yeah, I guess if somebody of said onion service developers are listening in now, you can maybe leave a comment in the pad or on the on IRC, and we'll be happy to read it. So I guess I have a question for you. So we're here at the the Internet Measurement Village. So we have a bunch of various different network measurement projects that are doing beyond just UNI. We have the IC Lab, we have Censored Planet, we have IOTA, we have all these great projects. We have RIPE. So I guess to you, as a developer of circumvention tools, and specifically working in the anti-censorship department, I would like to ask you, like, what is sort of your your dream feature, or what wish list would you have? Like, what gaps do you feel like are still present in the network measurement space that you think we could help to developers like yourself?
Right. I think the problem that I see is that it's a little bit difficult to sometimes establish ground truth, in the sense that you have a lot of measurement presence in different countries, in different networks, but sometimes you end up getting conflicting reports for various reasons, and that may be because censorship is not uniform inside countries, but the conflicting reports just make it really difficult to understand what exactly is happening. And another issue is that sometimes these measurements, in addition to these measurements, we have some anecdotal evidence, which again may be conflicting. And we have a lot of data sources, and it makes it a little bit difficult to have to quickly get an accurate idea of where something works and doesn't work. And I think that may not even necessarily be a very technical problem, but more of a problem of how can we take all these data sources and basically add them together in some kind of dashboard. And this dashboard should then make it easy to answer common questions. And if you want to go a little bit deeper, to dig into the actual technical data. And I understand that this is there to some degree. And I also acknowledge that this is a really difficult problem to solve. And it's not as simple as having some web page with some numbers on it, because the questions that people ask are very diverse. But I think that is probably item number one on my wish list, to have there be some kind of web page that aggregates the data and makes it easy to drill down into specific questions, as hard as that unfortunately may be.
Right. Yeah, that's some really good feedback. I think it's definitely a thing that we have to some extent thought about, but knowing that is high on the wish list is really great feedback. Thanks. So we have another question that comes from David F. And he asks, what is involved in creating a new pluggable transport?
Right. I would say, first of all, an idea. And once you have a good idea, everything else will follow. And when it comes to the idea, there are a lot of things to consider. For example, at this point, I would actually say that we're at a point where we have really good pluggable transports, and the problems that we're facing aren't so much pluggable transports as they are endpoint blocking. So for example, OBFS4 is really good in a sense that I have yet to see reliable blocking of the protocol itself. And the way OBFS4 is blocked by the Great Firewall is by scraping BridgeDB. And that is a bigger problem than we're facing at the moment than the actual pluggable transports. So this is also why we're looking into Salmon, because it provides a solution, albeit not a perfect one, but it is a solution to this problem of endpoint blocking. And so is Snowflake, because the assumption, or the hope rather, is that by having a lot of short-lived proxies that run inside people's browsers, it becomes too difficult or too tedious to maintain a blacklist, because you just have to refresh it all the time. And we will see how well this assumption will play out. But anyway, to actually answer your question, I would say you need an idea first, and we're always open to brainstorm and to give you feedback and to tell you the the shortcomings and also the great aspects of your idea. And then we can think about actually building it. And I'm not going to lie to you, building it is actually quite a bit of work. And our willingness to actually deploy a pluggable transports very much depends on how much use we can get out of it. And what some people often don't realize is that there are lots of good ideas out there and lots of pluggable transports we would love to have, but it really takes quite some work to get the code reviewed, to get it into Tor browser, to maintain it. And if the use we would get out of it is really not a ton, then the work to get it deployed may just not be worth it, which is, well, the sad truth. But I hope that answers your question. I don't want to discourage you from thinking about it because we could always use great ideas and we're very willing to discuss it, but don't get your hopes up and expect that your idea will be deployed next week because that's probably not going to happen.
Fair enough. Thanks. And I guess in answering this, I have another question about I guess pluggable transports and about like sort of the challenges that come with like making tools like Tor or any circumvention technology work in places that I would say, let's say, have like advanced censorship regimes, or places that are putting like a lot of effort into making Tor or similar tools not work. So like what are really like the challenges or limitations? Like what is the biggest problem that you're trying to solve, and like why aren't we like what's missing? And you mentioned before like about how Meek works to some extent in China, and that it's but it's expensive. So is the problem just a matter of like giving Tor like $20 million, or is it like what is the real big challenge there?
Right. When it comes to Meek, the answer may in fact be with an awful lot of money, we could uncap our CDN profile, and that really would go a long way towards helping people in China circumvent. In this particular case, the problem really is money, I'm afraid. But to answer the rest of your question, I would say the problems are really manifold, because I would say it's very easy to build a small system to circumvent the Great Firewall. It's actually very, very easy. All you need to do is some basic form of traffic obfuscation. The problem is doing that at scale, because once thousands, tens of thousands of people are using your system, you attract attention. The Great Firewall is suddenly paying attention to you, reading your code, and thinking about how to block it. And this is the step in the arms race that we are facing. And this is when it becomes really difficult, because we don't have a ton of resources. We have about a dozen people who pay some time to anti-censorship. And we're facing a very well-funded government, and not just one, but many of them. So it's a highly asymmetric arms race, which means that everything we do, we would like to be very confident that our time is very well spent. And of course, that isn't always possible. So I mentioned earlier that Snowflake was a big experiment in a sense that when people first conceived of it, it really wasn't clear that this is something that could even work. It turns out that thanks to our super smart developers and the work that they put into it, it turned out to work, but it wasn't guaranteed. So we do need to take risks sometimes, but we try to be very wise about the risk that we tackle, simply because of our few resources. And like I mentioned earlier, one very big problem we're facing now is the problem of endpoint blocking. There are only so many IPv4 addresses, and if all your circumvention infrastructure runs on a few of these addresses, then it's only a matter of time until they're enumerated and blocked. So at the moment, we're really thinking hard about new paradigms to fix that problem. And you can't just put all your eggs in one basket and hope that it works out. This is also why we're experimenting with Snowflake and in the near future with Salmon, because you really only see how things play out when you deploy them. It's very difficult to predict how sensors react, what they will do with your technology. For example, in the case of Meek, we didn't necessarily expect the bottleneck to be a matter of money. It's really hard to sustain this technology because of the cost that it involves. But you actually have to deploy infrastructure to see how it plays out. You just have to be wise about what sort of technology you end up deploying.
Right. And I guess to follow up on this, like what do you think is somehow, like, you think the solution, like the end game, is just like to keep, like, to put more money in like infrastructure and bandwidth, or like is there some other component to it that is like what's the right balance between sort of, you know, paying for the infrastructure? And I know like Tor somehow tries to focus more on perhaps like the technology. Like where's the balance, or where's the line between that?
I would say the line is definitely blurry. And I think one mistake we tech people frequently make is that we think of everything as a tech problem, and it really isn't. And especially now, we see very clearly that lobbying efforts to governments and tech companies are extremely important. Having friends inside tech companies is extremely important. And curating these relationships and having people do you favors so you just look better in the arms race that is internet censorship is very important. So there is a huge policy angle to all of that. And maybe some people are familiar with uh, refraction networking, which relies on the cooperation of ISPs. And that is definitely a technical problem to some degree, but the technical problem is solved. What remains to be solved is the political, the policy angle, and that is a huge issue where we just need a ton of help, not just from the tech world, but also from people inside governments. So I would say the balance is to really tackle this problem from many different fronts. And one front is technology, for sure. Another front is policy. We need a lot of money to fund our work. So I would say just be creative. Think of ways to move forward and to provide people with access to circumvention technology. And I would say the biggest success stories were always the really creative ones, because you just have to take risks and experiment with new technologies.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that. So we have another question that comes from Jack Wampler. Would a large number of bridge users, would a large number of bridges help to fight bridge enumeration and scraping from BridgeDB? Or is the challenge in distribution itself? For example, deploying Salmon.
Right. Unfortunately, at the moment, because of shortcomings in BridgeDB, I would say a large number of bridges definitely helps to some degree. I mean, I still encourage people to set up bridges, but since at least China has some success in scraping BridgeDB, this success is the success through new bridges is somewhat limited because we have about 1,400 bridges now, and what if we had 5,000? Eventually, they will be scraped and end up on block lists, and they would still be useful to a lot of users in different countries, because part of the problem is just slow and unreliable bridges, but it wouldn't be a huge success simply because it's a larger number, because scraping remains an issue, and that is the sort of issue that Salmon will solve.
Okay, great. Thanks for that. Unfortunately, this is all the time we have for questions. I would like to thank you again so much, Philipp, for joining us today. And I would also like to thank you and all of your colleagues at the Tor project for the really important work that you're doing in advancing internet freedom and building technologies and tools that allow people to circumvent censorship all over the world. So really, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and thank you everyone for attending and asking all these questions.
Yeah. And again, also thank you to everybody who tuned in from the internet. I'll remind you that as perhaps this is part of the Internet Measurement Village. So we have a session every day at this time on this channel. And in particular, tomorrow we have a session at 1400 UTC, which is we'll be joined by Zach Weinberg from ICLab, and he'll be telling us about the work that they're doing at ICLab measuring internet censorship. So, thanks for joining, and we'll see you here tomorrow. Bye.